Welcome everyone. So I'm sort of, I suppose, a commissioning perspective. So this is where we get past the stage where it's been to trial and it is now sort of, I suppose, available for the NHS. So I won't go through the marketing authorization part of things, but why that's happening, NICE generally is sort of scanning trials, scanning a platform called PharmaScan or device scan, and sort of picking up what's coming through the system. So they sort of it comes into the system in terms of whether or not they need to do a technical appraisal on those drugs. And there's two important documents, I suppose, that are relevant to this. So there's the Prescribed Service Manual, which was developed as a result of the Health and Social Care Act and the formation of NHS England Specialised commissioning, and that describes who and how services are commissioned. So for cancer drugs predominantly, they're high cost drugs and they're specialised commissioning. When you hear things about postcode lotteries, perhaps it's something that goes to a CCG and sort of commissioned on a local basis. And it was mentioned briefly in the previous talk around the voluntary scheme for branded medications for pricing and access. Now, the rules changed for that in 2019, whereas previously it was selective which drugs went to NICE for TA on a basis of NHS importance and patient importance. Now all new licensed medications are automatically reviewed by NICE. So that's a slightly different change. And the Secretary of State must approve NICE's work programme for the appraisal of the new drug. So it might be totally new drugs, or it might be drugs that have been licensed for another indication. But that's not the only route. NICE isn't the only route. There is also the NHS England policy route for commissioning new medications, and I'm going to cover off a bit of that in this talk as well, which might be for a drug being used in an unlicensed indication, or it might be that for some reason NICE doesn't pick up the TA because it is such a niche drug and there doesn't add value doing a TA. I think it's quite important to sort of highlight that a technical appraisal is actually quite a big undertaking by the company. It's quite time consuming. They're also usually trying to do that at the same time as they're trying to get it through the regulatory process as well. So it can be sort of, especially for a small company, if they've only got the one product, say it's a new sort of startup, they can really struggle to probably be doing regulatory agency sort of processes in several countries or across several different regions, and also trying to do a TA as well for NICE, plus a lot of other countries have taken on similar sort of processes as NICE, and so they just haven't got the capacity to do that. So sometimes that's why you might see the reluctance, or things go a lot slower than we would like to see, coming from license to going through this process and being made available. So I'll quickly go through NICE, or some of it was covered. So NICE work to a set is independent. It's not part of NHS England or the NHS. It's a totally separate body, and they have a set of principles around aims to identify high quality, good value, and provides best outcomes. Like I said, they typically start the assessment process before the pharmaceutical company has launched the drug in the UK, to try and sort of make sure that you don't get that gap between licensing and it being available for people to use. Doesn't always happen because there is a delay in the process for some reason, and it can sort of stretch out the process a little bit. So there's three main areas, as mentioned before: the scoping, assessment, and appraisal. And I think it's probably quite important to sort of say that patient groups are involved in all those, or especially the scoping stage, where they're sort of deciding on what the assessment should look like. So it determines the specific questions needed to be addressed. For example, which diseases and patient groups to consider, which existing drugs to compare the drug against, and any assessment. So that's also quite important as well, because quite often the trials might compare it against one treatment regime, where in the UK there might be a variation. We might use a different treatment regime in practice. So you can quite often get that difference. So you need to sort of work that through. In the appraisal stage, again, when they go through that, the patients groups are usually involved in that, as well as at the NHS. NHS quite often puts in quite a big submission at this stage, sort of looking at the population, the cost, the alternative drugs, because quite often the list price of drugs is different to the actual NHS price, and sort of that all's got to be factored in, plus the strength of the clinical evidence. So that can take some time, especially if it's quite complicated or there's a lot of alternative treatments that need to be considered. We're doing one for HIV at the moment, and there's something like 50 different HIV treatments, so it sort of can make it quite complex. So then it goes to the third stage, when it goes to the appraisal committee and the decision's been made, and that again can be an area where things can be delayed. So if everything's going well and there's good evidence, it'll go through the appraisal committee first time, and it continues on its approval process. Sometimes, though, it will go back to the appraisal committee several times before it's approved. It might be they want more evidence, they might want a longer time frame, they might ask for more financial evidence around the modelling. You also sometimes find that the sort of licensing dosing is different to the real world dosing of certain drugs and that sort of thing. So it sort of all sort of impacts on the economic evaluation against the effectiveness. So the cost benefit threshold. So I don't know, probably a lot of you know about this. So NICE tend to recommend adoption of drugs with an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, which is I suppose the cost of the new versus the cost of the standard treatment divided by the effectiveness of the new versus the standard treatment, and keeps the QALY below £20,000. There is some sort of flexibility in that. Sometimes goes up to £30,000 if your sort of numbers are quite certain. And qualities are calculated by estimating the years of life remaining for a patient following a particular treatment or intervention, and weighting each year with a quality of life score. It is often measured in terms of a person's ability to carry out their activities in daily life and freedom from pain and mental disturbance. So it does seem sort of quite harsh putting a sort of a financial value on things, but I think you've got to have some way of evaluating that. In 2017, a new step was introduced around the £20 million in any of its first 3 years. This followed on from the introduction of Hep C drugs, which were brilliant drugs, game-changing in terms of they're a cure for Hep C, but pretty much if we'd treated everyone with Hep C in the first year with these drugs when they became available, it would have been the whole Specialised commissioning drug budget for that year, plus a bit more. It was done in a phased approach where the treatment with the patients with the worst symptoms were treated first. Since then, it's gone on, and actually now there's several drugs available. The prices of drugs have come down, can treat far more people than initially planned, and England is well on the way to meeting the sort of elimination of hepatitis C as a public health risk by 2030. So this is one of the sort of areas where this sort of thing has been really successful. Since that was put in place, there's been about 30 different drugs that meet this qualification, and they've gone on to negotiate. Those companies gone on to negotiate with NHS England, come to some sort of commercial deal, and none of them have had to go on to that sort of phased introduction as a result. They've sort of come to a deal that the sort of patients can get those as soon as they're available, or can be, being one of the most recent ones, the most high profile ones, I suppose, for cystic fibrosis. There's also more flexibility for orphan drugs for very rare conditions. So that's where there's only 2 or 3 patients might have a condition. So it's very high cost drugs. And there's a bit more flexibility around that as well. So again, once NICE approval, generally has 90 days to implement a new drug. And then also there's the 20 million sort of phased implementation to mitigate financial risk. But the delay there usually isn't around that phased implementation. It's usually around a negotiation with NHS England and the drug company around the cost of the drugs. So also the Cancer Drug Fund. So it delivers a range of benefits, that including earlier access for patients to the most promising treatments. It's a fast-track NICE process. So the drug's available to patients while the NICE appraisals going on. It's clearer and faster decision making about which cancer drugs are available. All new cancer drugs and significant new licensed indications for cancer drugs are referred to NICE for appraisal. So that's if it's an existing drug, new licensed indication. There's financial certainty with a fixed budget and a mechanism to control expenditure. Patient access is it still there while there's an uncertainty around the drug's effectiveness, and that can be assessed through data collection as part of that process. And there's greater flexibility for NHS England and the deals agreed with the pharmaceutical industry. I think England is actually quite lucky. It's quite a large drug market, and basically, even though the US might seem larger, you're dealing with individual sort of insurance organisations. Europe, places like Germany, you're dealing with individual states, whereas England, if you get the whole drug market, it's quite a large, one of the largest single drug markets. So it gives us some good opportunities to negotiate good deals with pharma, and it also gets them access to a large population. So that's quite interesting. The new sort of things that are coming through for drugs which are a challenge to NICE and NHS England are things like CAR-T and advanced therapy medicinal products. They're quite technical. There's lots of work that needs to be done with providers, and we've had to sort of, I suppose, in some ways, we might call go at risk with waiting for the NICE appraisal. We're doing a lot of work with the hospitals that will provide these, because there's lots of training, there's lots of regulatory requirements they need to complete to offer these treatments. So trusts and NHS England have worked together to get those in place. So when NICE does make their decision and it's ready to go, the providers are in a place where they can provide those services as soon as possible. So sometimes a drug, for some reason, NICE doesn't add it to their work plan. It's getting less and less. It might be for an unlicensed treatment, so for a drug that is not licensed for that particular indication, or it might be for a procedure, an unusual procedure. Sometimes, evidence comes available that something in particular works. So it won't be covered by NICE because it's not licensed. So NHS England can produce their own policies, and that will lay out the mandated NHS England commissioning position on that drug. It sometimes might be for the opposite reason. There might not be to get access. It might be that there has been evidence to show that this is actually harmful to patients, and we might decide to put in place a not routinely commissioned policy, or there's no evidence to support it. One of the drugs we see most commonly in these policies is rituximab. Rituximab cures everything, so we seem to have a policy, lots of policies for rituximab for various indications. So there's 3 phases to that. There's the clinical build, where we actually work on the clinical side of things. And again, patients are all involved in this. So we have a patient on the policy working group for any of these policies, and they're sort of involved in the formation of the policy. We have an impact sort of stage where there's not just the financial impact, there's also the equalities impact, the patient impact, and the governance stage, which is the sign off, I suppose, where it goes to CPAG, who look at the policy in terms of its clinical appropriateness to make sure we've considered things like equality and that sort of thing. It doesn't consider the financial aspects. That's done separately. But we have 2 types of policies, I suppose. We have those that are cost neutral to NHS specialised commissioning. So it's important to note that to specialised commissioning, because if it might be cost neutral to the NHS overall, but if it's still a cost impact on specialised commissioning, it still needs to go through the prioritisation process. So prioritisation is a strange animal to a certain degree, but the general principles are as around transparency, patient and public voice. So we have patient reps on CPAG who make the decision. It works, and then it's around clinical effectiveness and benefit to patient. It's fair and equitable in a way that it accounts for rare conditions. So it's worked out on a cost per patient basis rather than a cost overall. We do a lot of work around health inequalities, in that we have to put an inequalities assessment into the policy. Value for money, we have a sort of a certain envelope we have to operate within that. And it's quite strange in that, and anything goes to a prioritisation CPAG, which happens twice a year, that you're comparing the clinical effectiveness of those policies to each other. So you might have two totally different policies, one for a cancer treatment and one for a MS treatment. So it's sort of like and the CPAG have the very unenviable job of sort of rating the clinical priority of those policies, and then the financial value is added to it afterwards, and they sort of make a calculation from there. It receives a score like a risk score, and they sort of then make drugs available as a result. A drug or procedure that isn't accepted at a particular CPAG for prioritisation isn't excluded. It can go up to 3 CPAGs before we say, right, this isn't ever going to meet the required level to be sort of commissioned. Quite often, though, in that time, there's a lot of work done with the drug company or other service providers to try and negotiate a better price to make it available for some particularly high cost items. Other funding methods that are clinically effective, we'll look at other funding methods for sometimes. There's 3 types of policy. There's a standard policy, there's a policy statement. A policy statement is generally used for where there's only 1 or 2 pieces of evidence, usually fairly good quality evidence. So we'll sort of do a slightly rapid evidence review because of the small amount of evidence, and try and get that policy through a bit quicker. Or it might be a filling position. So if we know that in future that there'll be a TA, but we want to put a policy in place in the meantime. Urgent policy is if there is something that comes out that is particularly urgent, there's a fast track process. So I think the obvious one for that one is vaginal mesh, because we wanted a not routinely commissioned policy for it. An urgent policy was put in place. And then during COVID, we have what we call rapid COVID-19 policy statements. So in our blood and marrow transplant area, we've done a couple of quick policies to support transplant patients. I suppose we say honourable mention on there is individual funding requests, which are for exceptional cases. So if for some reason, I don't know, a patient has to be really exceptional to get an IFR. So it's not just having CLL wouldn't be exceptional. What would be exceptional is if for some reason you couldn't take the 2 standard treatments, say because you had some sort of allergy to them or something like that. You might be able to get a 3rd treatment because of that exceptionality. So they're the main routes to a policy and funding. Now, the NHS England policies tend to happen later in the process than a NICE TA. So whereas like I said, NICE try and align their technical appraisal process up with the licensing of a new product, we probably in NHS England don't start our policies until you get to the stage where there's evidence to publish, because it's got to be published peer review evidence we use, and or it is licensed. So there is that sort of delay in NHS England policies. NICE also currently have, because of the changes to the voluntary scheme and everything going through there, they've recently done a lot of work, and hopefully they were due to release it in around now, around reviewing their TA processes to try and put a quicker process in place. That has been delayed slightly during to COVID and the extra work that NICE was asked to do. I thought this was quite an interesting slide. I've taken it from a King's Fund report, but it shows the typical evolution of drug price and sales, and the brown line being the price and the sales of a new drug and a difference. So you've got the product launch and the sales increase, market exclusivity, and then as other things come in to the market, the price falls. And then you get sales of substitute drugs come through like that. A classic example of that we've seen in HIV recently, where a couple of the big name branded drugs have suddenly become generic. And for NHS England, we've seen about 140 million pounds worth of savings on HIV drugs over the last 2 years, which is, makes a big difference, and that money can be reinvested elsewhere. The link I was talking about, this is quite a good resource. It explains around the process of getting drugs to market and why they cost so much. So I'm sure that the CLL team can make that available on their site as well if they want to make it available to everyone to have a look at. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.